Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for a festive session of our series, Why Marx? We've got with us one main speaker and a singer. Jack Conrad will be starting the session with a meeting on Jesus the Revolutionary. And then we had an email from Rosselson, a famous folk singer, who says maybe it wasn't Jesus who's the main revolutionary. So we're going to hear from both. First, though, over to Jack. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, I thought I'd got rid of my own picture, but obviously not. Jesus. First thing to say, I suppose, is that we actually have no contemporary evidence of Jesus, i.e., year whatever you want to call it, year 1, year BC, year when we sort of would guess sometime when he died. There is no contemporary record of hey, there was this man and he's performing miracles and wow, he's reversed the laws of nature, making the dead rise from their graves and other such fantastic things. Now, a number of thinkers, quite a few, have concluded from that Jesus therefore didn't exist. There's quite a literature to that effect. My own take on it, for what it's worth, is I'm quite prepared to accept that someone who we'll call Jesus existed. I'm quite prepared to accept that we get a sort of filtered, distorted account of this man in the 4 main Gospels and in other New Testament documents. But we cannot we cannot simply take the Bible as our starting point, simply because actually you've got a whole number of different accounts that actually contradict each other. So my own approach is first of all to say that using the method of historical materialism, we can sort of frame a background that is pretty accurate about the sort of times that this individual lived in. And that will tell us something about, probably, not definitely, I don't know what I'm saying is, I'm not claiming what I'm saying is the truth. What I'm claiming is that what I'm putting forward is a probable account, how should you put it, an on balance account. And on that basis, we can discount an awful lot that appears in the Bible as fabulation, and perhaps we can leave other elements as something that was so well known to his followers that it either uncontroversially made its way into what eventually became the Bible, or it was too difficult to take out. So in terms of historical materialism, a few things to say. First of all, that what is called Israel today, Israel, Palestine, the Holy Land, at the time of Jesus, this was a province, either of sort of the remnants of Alexander the Great's empire, but it was an area of the world that was falling under Roman domination. And what we can gather from both very good historical evidence, but also from inference, from, how should I put it, deduction, we can work out, as I said, some sort of probable account of who Jesus was, what he did stand for, and most certainly what he didn't stand for. So I begin by discounting what I think is obvious invention. So I don't think myself that Jesus was born of a virgin. I doubt that is possible. I doubt very much that this man who was born of a virgin, I doubt very much that he ended up in an inn in Bethlehem in, I'll call it AD 1. We don't know. We know that that was made up. We don't know when he was born, but I doubt very much he was born in a stable of an inn. I doubt very much 3 kings came visiting, claiming whatever they claimed, bringing fabulous gifts. I also doubt very much that the local king had issued orders to execute every boy child below the below 2 years of age. I doubt very much that an angel came to Joseph, Jesus's, well, I call him adopted father, and said, flee, flee, flee to Egypt, and all the rest of it. I think that this is later invention, as are stories about Jesus's early life, when purportedly, for example, he goes to the temple in Jerusalem and outwits, the temple priests and the scribes. I doubt very much that was the case. So, who was Jesus? Well, I would argue that if, and it is a big if, but we'll take it as a given. If he was born in the north, if he was born in Galilee at the time of his probable birth, this was an area that hadn't been fully incorporated into the Roman Empire. It was dominated by the Romans. After a revolt which we know about, in what we now call the Common Era, year 6, the Romans did incorporate this territory into their empire. And we also know, we've got very good evidence, it's just undeniable, that the Romans were widely despised. They were passionately hated. And given the nature of the period that we were talking about, inevitably resistance would take the form of religious ideas. So the biblical Jesus is a very strange person, given that background. Nowhere does he seem to say that we must overthrow the Roman oppressors. And indeed, if you look at the Bible, Jesus expresses admiration for the Romans. It's the Romans that are the first to say, this must have been the Son of God. It's the Romans that, Jesus goes out and courts, and it's the Jews progressively, as the Bible gets older, who are denounced. So he's a very strange person, and yet the Bible tells us that this individual gained a mass following, that everywhere he went, there were masses of people, looking for inspiration from him. He didn't just have 12 disciples, he had the masses behind him. So trying to put forward a probable version of his life, what I would suggest is that this individual, whether his father was a carpenter, I don't know, but he appears to be well educated. He's certainly well educated when it comes to what we would now call the Old Testament. He knows his scripture. He knows what various prophets have predicted. He knows what they say. And he would have therefore been, we can hazard, some sort of rabbi. That just means a religious teacher. But what we would guess is that he went from simply being a teacher to someone who felt that he had a prophetic mission. And his prophetic mission would have been to usher in, to prepare the way for God's kingdom on earth, God's kingdom on earth, where the Romans would be swept away, of where the poor inherit the earth, and where the rich, if they don't repent, if they don't give away their wealth, will be cast into hell. And what we again can work out, if we take the Bible account as at least one point of reference, is that Jesus, this rabbi, this prophet, also started to consider him and started to put himself forward as King Jesus. Not in the kingdom of heaven, but the kingdom of earth. And it's interesting, not because I believe it, that if you take two Gospels, that's Mark and Luke, they both have in them Jesus's family tree. They happen to be different, names being mentioned. But what is significant isn't the fact that Jesus was related to Adam. After all, we're all meant to be related to Adam. No, the interesting thing in these two Gospels, and I presume that's some sort of remainder that either the rewriters felt they couldn't take out or saw no reason to take out. I'm only hazarding a guess. But what they both do is trace Jesus biologically through Joseph to King David, the King David whose royal seat was originally in Bethlehem and then in Jerusalem. David was the founder, the great king of Israel. And if you believe it, and I don't, he and his son presided over a huge empire that not only covered today's Israel-Palestine, but went from the river to the sea. And the river we were talking about here in the Bible, and we're talking about the Old Testament, is the river Euphrates and the river Nile, and the sea that we're talking about is, of course, the Mediterranean. So if we look at this Jesus, he wasn't claiming to be an ordinary king. What he was claiming to be was the final king, the prophetic final king, who would, as I say, bring justice to the world, would kick out and defeat the Romans, and would institute heaven on earth. That seems to be what he believed, and it also seems to be what his disciples and followers believe. So we get this section in the Bible of where Jesus and his two closest disciples go up a mountain. It could be Mount Tabor, it could be Mount Hermon. This is in the north. And he is transfigured. He's turned into something else. He takes on board the Holy Spirit. And from there, what we have in the Bible is him traveling down south, down the course of the Jordan. He crosses the Jordan. He's curing people all along his route. I'm guessing that in every town and every village, there must have been professional beggars who were, how should I put it, professionally blind, professionally crippled, who Jesus cured. But above all, what he was doing is preaching the end of times. And we know that that was something that was big amongst the Jewish population of the first century BC and the 1st century, what we now call AD, or the Common Era. If you want to get into the thought world of these people, I'm not saying that this is directly related to Jesus, but in terms of a sort of pattern of thinking, I can recommend nothing more strongly than having a look at the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls. These were written over a very long period. The last of them were written on the cusp of the Jewish Revolution, 66 to 70, which saw the sacking by the Romans of Jerusalem. And what you get from that particular sect is a description of them going in for military training. They expect that the vast mass of the Jewish population will join them. But above all, what they're expecting is divine intervention. The other source that I would recommend, okay, isn't contemporary, but it's sort of near enough contemporary to at least get us into the thought world of the times that Jesus inhabited Palestine. And there are 2 books in particular, the Jewish Antiquities and the Jewish War. This is written by a guy called Flavius Josephus. Who was Josephus? Well, he was Jewish. He was a Jewish aristocrat, and he participated on the Jewish side in the Jewish Revolution of 66. He also then crossed sides. He defected to the Romans, and he wrote these 2 books with a large degree of I'm going to entertain the Romans, but as well as an awful lot of myth in them. He's actually writing, I think, something you could seriously call history. So he describes, for example, the siege of Jerusalem. He describes the period before the Jewish Revolution, and interestingly, he described bandits and false prophets. These people are misleading the masses. And clearly what he's talking about isn't simply con artists or normal thieves. What he appears to be talking about is revolutionaries. And he describes them as taking vengeance against the rich. Some of them want to abolish slavery, for example. Some of them are Republicans and saying that humans should have no masters other than God. So some of them are Republican. Others, their leaders crown themselves as kings in the sort of manner, I would guess, that we saw in medieval times when peasant leaders in England rebelled against, I don't know, the Plantagenets and claimed to be, in reality, the great grandson or something along those lines of the last Saxon kings. Interestingly, also, Josephus, I think, accurately describes what he calls 3 main parties. We're not talking about modern political parties, but this is the word that's translated. 3 main parties existing at the times. And one of them are the Sadducees. These are the priest caste. This is the priest caste that dominates in the Jerusalem temple. Purportedly, there were something like 1,500 of them. The Jerusalem temple is partially, for praying, partially for slaughter, ritualistic slaughter. But also what he describes is a rapid class differentiation amongst the priesthood and the emergence of something like half a dozen top priests who dominate and exploit the temple. These people are well educated. They don't believe in nonsense from their point of view, like the dead rising from the grave. They don't believe that God will come down to help them. They believe reluctantly in collaborating with the Roman authorities. But nonetheless, what they are clearly is an elite. The other party, which Josephus seems to admire, are the Pharisees. What's interesting about the priest class is that officially, ever since the Persian domination of Palestine, officially the age of prophecy was closed. And the job of the priests is simply to repeat standard scripture, to oversee rituals, not to explain, not to write something new down. And it precisely under those conditions, we see the rise of the Pharisees. These are interpreters of the law. These people are attacked, as you know, frequently by Jesus in the Bible. And interestingly, I suppose because of the writers of the Bible attacked the Pharisees, a number of writers, such as, for example, Karl Kautsky in his Foundations of Christianity, classic book, please read it. But also more recently, again, a very good book by a guy called Hyman Maccabee. He was an Oxford scholar. The Pharisees are interpreted as the popular party. It has to be said that Robert Eisenman, and I'll come to him in a little while, disagrees with that and basically goes with the Jesus that we have in the Bible of attacking the Pharisees. And it's interesting, again, if you look, okay, you have to interpret. If you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, they denounce people who are, how should I put it, the seekers after smooth things. And Robert Eisenman interprets that as a reference to the Pharisees. Again, interestingly, Josephus describes what he calls the third party. These are the Essenes. These people he describes as communists to perfection. That's a quote. Okay, I know it's a translation, but communists to perfection. They live in camps. These people can be interpreted as having something similar, we would guess, not the same, but something similar to those that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. Josephus, wants to amuse his Roman readers, and he says, do you know that they are obsessed with cleanliness? Even after they have a poo, they go and clean themselves. But of course, the Essenes weren't aware of modern, germ theory. What they were doing is cleaning themselves to make themselves receptive to read the text and interpret the text and write new holy texts on the basis of divine inspiration. And interestingly, again, Josephus describes what he calls the fourth philosophy, the fourth party. And this is the party, I think, that I would place Jesus, the Zealots, the Sicarii, apocalyptic revolutionaries, guerrilla fighters, rebels against the Jewish elite, but rebels above all against Roman occupation. And we know that these rebels rose up, first of all, against the Greeks and famously defeated a whole Greek army that was sent to crush them from Syria. We know that these people also defeated a Roman legion. And we also know, of course, that in 66 to 70, these people rose up against the Romans, captured Jerusalem, and some of them then resisted the Romans in that fortress of Masada, way south of Jerusalem, until they were finally overcome in AD 74, when famously, at least according to the accounts that we have, I think it was something like 900 fighters and their families committed suicide rather than surrendering to the Romans, who would have, of course, butchered them either directly or taken them and put them in, the Colosseum or something equivalent of that for entertainment. Okay, so my argument would be, therefore, that Jesus was one of many such apocalyptic revolutionaries. I presume most people here have seen Life of Brian and the famous scene, I think it was of the shoe, wasn't it? And was it the gird? You can imagine a situation of where Palestine is teeming with prophets, with redeemers, with resistance fighters. People thought that they were living in the end of times. Their expectation was of the end of the world. We're talking about the popular masses, not the Sadducees, not the Romans. Okay, so what I would argue on that basis is that the probable Jesus probably didn't say, resist not an evil person. I don't believe that one, along with the virgin birth. I don't believe that the probable Jesus would have said, render unto Caesar's what Caesar's, i.e. pay your taxes. It just doesn't add up. No one is going to gain a mass following on the basis of saying, basically, accept Roman rule. My kingdom isn't of here. It's for somewhere else when you're dead. Caesar, pay taxes to Caesar. We know, at least in terms of the Bible, what the Romans and what Pontius Pilate, the governor, charged Jesus with. They put over his head, didn't they, when they crucified him? And I'm taking that again as a sort of story that the rewriters of the Bible felt that they couldn't remove, but it does strike me as a probably correct story. Here is the King of the Jews. The temple priest said he claimed to be. And Pontius Pilate said, I had written what I have written. And they also charge him. And this is the temple priests and the Roman authorities with calling for an uprising against the Romans and refusal to pay taxes. I'm taking that as a probably accurate story. So what did Jesus expect as he progressed down from the north, as I said, either from Mount Hermon or Mount Tabor? What did he preach? What did he expect? Well, if you again take the account of the Bible, he comes in to Jerusalem. We're told it's a festival time. Okay, Passover, that's possible. The crowds greet him. Right, he rides in to Jerusalem on the back of an ass. That is something that is symbolic. He isn't just riding on some poor little donkey, to display his humility. This is something that was prophesied by one of the so-called minor prophets, one of the great prophets, in my view, Micah, in what we call the Old Testament. The Messiah will ride on an ass. Jesus comes into Jerusalem. Who knows what the population was? 100,000, maybe doubled at a festival time. So it's heaving. How is he greeted? He's greeted with Hosanna, save us. The masses throw leaves down in front of him. Again, according to the Bible, Jesus, supported by the masses, goes to the temple. According to the Bible, he clears out the money lenders. I don't believe that one. I think what he clears out are the top priests, the top Sadducee priests, not all of them. The temple keeps functioning, but the Jesus party has seized hold of the temple. Sacrifices keep happening. The less important, the less elite of the Sadducee priests debate with Jesus, but Jesus, we're told, has the support of the masses. And although the Sadducee priests have a temple guard, they dare not touch him. What does Jesus expect? He seems to have expected to hold the temple for a week, and then God will intervene. What sort of intervention? Well, after the Last Supper, Jesus goes outside of the temple wall, Garden of Gethsemane. His disciples have got 2 swords. That's enough, Jesus says. And he prays and prays and prays. That's the description in the Bible. Nothing happens except we are told a cohort, that's roughly speaking, 300 Roman soldiers come, along with temple guards, and they seize Jesus. And we're told in the Bible, and we're going to have a song about it, I understand. So I don't know whether Leon and myself agree here on this story, but we're told, I think completely improbably, that it's Judas, the treasurer of the Jesus party, one of the 12 disciples, who goes up to Jesus and gives him a kiss to identify him. I think it just doesn't work out. Here's this guy who's come into Jerusalem on this ass. He's being greeted by the masses. He is preaching every day in the temple. There are the Sadducees. There are the Romans looking on. They would recognize him. They didn't need Judas and 30 pieces of silver saying, "Take me to the man." They would have known him. He would be famous over those 7 or 8 days. So what's going on in the Bible? I think that this is an attempt to blacken the name of Jesus's disciples. Indeed, what you have is the story of Peter. You will betray me. Is it 3 times? You have a situation all the way through of Jesus's disciples not understanding what Jesus's message is. Well, I can understand it if it's the New Testament message as we have coming down to us. But if you take the sort of message I've described to you, they would have understood it perfectly well. This would be something deep, deep in their culture. They would have been on the inside. They would have been the 12 representing the 12 so-called tribes of Israel. And indeed, when we come to the story again of Jesus saying, "I have no family, send my mother away." This is again a piece of later propaganda, because what we would believe, and again you can find it in the Bible, except it's the earliest bit of the New Testament, is that after Jesus's death, his party is taken over by his brothers, not least James the Just. And if you look in your New Testament, you'll find a Gospel of James. I'm not claiming that every word is James, but it is worthwhile pointing out that if you want evidence of class war and vengeance against the rich and the elevation of the poor, look no further than the Gospel of James. James is testified historically. So whereas in, for example, Josephus's Jewish Antiquities, we have passages referencing, and they called him Christ. Ever since Voltaire, and there's no debate about it nowadays, people have said that's so obviously a forgery. Josephus couldn't have said it, didn't say it. Now, we don't know who forged it. You might guess some pious Christian monk who was transcribing the words of Josephus, and that book was viewed as the fifth gospel of Christian. Hey, there's no mention of Jesus. Well, he must have, he must have mentioned the Son of God. So, okay, I know what he would have said, or someone did it cynically. We simply don't know. But there's no way that Josephus could have called Jesus Christ, which is the Latin word for anointed one. So we're talking about the anointed one, the Messiah. No, Josephus didn't. But we do have contemporary evidence of James the Just. And we do know something about James the Just. And all I would argue is that if we know James the Just, and again, none of this is 100%, but if we know something about James the Just, who took over after Jesus, I would argue that we might find something else about Jesus himself. So if we look at James the Just, he was famous. He was called Camel Knees. That's because he spent so long kneeling on the ground praying. James the Just wore the same clothes until they got ragged. James the Just did not drink alcohol. This was forbidden. So my guess again is when we come to the first miracle, I rather like the miracle myself, the wedding and turning water into wine. This is not only fantastic because you can't turn water into wine, certainly not good wine, not just by maggery pokery. No, this is again a later invention, and it's an insult. It's a deliberate insult to the original Jesus Party and the initial leaders of the Jesus Party after the execution of their leader. We know that it was James the Just, and then after he was killed, the party is taken over by Simeon, a nephew of Jesus. So we also think that not only was James the Just a brother of Jesus, and that's testified in the Acts of the Apostles, whose author we could call, for want of anything better, Paul, Saulus. That's the first book in terms of chronological order. Saulus, who was an original persecutor of the Jesus Party, not of Jesus, but of the Jesus Party. Remember, he has this blinding conversion on the road to Damascus. Take it as you will. But what's he do after he sees a vision of Jesus? He goes to Jerusalem. This is his words, or the words of the Acts, and introduces himself to the brothers of Jesus, led by James the Just. And so shitty is Paul's reputation amongst the Jews. He's a Roman collaborator, that they say, go off and, mix with the Gentiles, convert the Gentiles, make them become, sort of camp followers of the party. Either way, we have evidence, as I said, of James the Just and the sort of thought world of these people. Okay, so I've described Jesus. I've described his arrest. I've described the charges against him. This is from, again, the Bible. Says that this was the temple priests and all the rest of it drag Jesus before Pilate. He's the Roman governor, nice guy. Pilate questions Jesus and says, well, just seems to be a harmless chap to me. Oh, look, it's Passover. Oh, we have this strange Jewish custom, which I abide by, of letting prisoners go. Well, one, there is no such tradition And the idea, by the way, of Roman governors being reasonable and civilized and tolerant is pretty hard to square. What we have with Roman governors, what we have with Roman rule, is absolutely vicious oppression. Not only are the peasants squeezed when it comes to extracting taxes, anyone who dares rebel, what we have is mass execution. We're talking about thousands of people dying the most horrible of deaths. The Romans designed the cross to make it the most agonizing death that they could conceive of. Okay, so apparently Pontius Pilate says, well, what's wrong with this guy? Come on, let's see what the masses have to say about this guy. And it's the Jewish masses that shout, crucify him. Let Barabbas go. He's a thief. We don't need to take that one seriously. There was no such custom. The point of the Bible is to make sure that the Jews are collectively guilty for the killing of the Christian man God. They were guilty. The blood libel, which anti-Semites in the church and beyond, of course, have used ever since. That wouldn't have happened. That's like saying that, you know, in Nazi-occupied Poland, there was this strange custom every Easter or something like that of where prisoners were released. And so the Gauleiter in Warsaw is confronted by the Warsaw masses, and he says, who do you want me to release? Well, I've got this liberation fighter here, a member of the Bund, say, or maybe a member of the Polish Communist Party, or maybe a member of the Polish Socialist Party. We've got these guys on the one. Do you want these people released, or do you want a common murderer released? And we're meant to believe that the Warsaw masses, with a history of socialism, with a history of militant opposition to the Nazis, are meant to shout out, no, kill the resistance fighters. We are guilty, and all our children will be guilty of this crime. It's not convincing. Probably, again, we don't know, but probably, you know, if you just use 1 and 1, and okay, maybe make 3, but probably the masses, if they'd been shouting anything, would have been release Jesus, release Jesus, release Jesus. And far from abiding by what the masses were saying, Pontius Pilate most certainly wouldn't have felt any pressure to make any concessions. Quite the opposite, because what we get again in the Bible is a description of Jesus beaten, spat upon, paraded through the streets naked, with a crown of thorns on his head, with a little reed, with a cloak. He's paraded before the masses. This is a humiliation for the King of the Jews. It's a humiliation for the Jerusalem Jewish population. This is a warning of what happens to rebels against the Roman Empire. And what I'll do, I'll just finish by saying this. Whereas so many other apocalyptic revolutionaries failed, Jesus failed. What made him different is his party thought that he would rise from the dead. But what we have in terms of the modern Christian religion is taking that story that Jesus's party believed and remaking it in a way that was acceptable to the Roman oppressors, to the point where under Constantine, many years later, it's adopted. Christianity, the Pauline Christianity, is adopted as the official religion of the Roman Empire. And as they say, the rest is another story. I'll finish there. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you very much, Jack. A tour de force through history and the history of Jesus and the Bible. And clearly Jesus a contested figure or contested figures, and with a fabricated history, and a history written by the victors, as often happens. Leon, you got in touch because you wanted to disagree with Jack when you saw the headline of Jesus the Revolutionary, but I suspect you actually not have that dissimilar a view. Hi, thanks for joining us. You need to unmute, Comrade. You're still muted, I'm afraid. I'll send you another notification. You need to click the little button. It worked earlier.
Leon, you're still muted.
Muted, I'm afraid. I send you a little notification. Should see it on your phone or computer if you just click that button. Do it again.
I'm sorry.
There you are. Well done.
It still says unmute. Am I heard now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thanks for joining.
Computers.
I know.
Yeah, I said I share some of the reading that Jack has mentioned, the Hiram Maccabee book and Josephus. Yeah, but my starting point here is the gospel Jesus, not any speculation as to who Jesus was, because really we don't know any other Jesus. It's all speculation. The only Jesus we have is the Bible Jesus, and it is in the real world, it is the Bible Jesus, the gospel Jesus, who founded a church with its subsequent rather gory history. And my song is about the gospel Jesus, and I should say that the gospel writers were not contemporaries of Jesus. Of course, they were writing long after they didn't know Jesus. They were writing long after Jesus was supposed to have been crucified, something like 70, I think, Mark to 100, which is John. So these are fabrication. The Jesus in the gospel is a fabrication. But as I say, it is that Jesus with the help of St. Paul that founded a church, and that's my problem. So I wrote this song some time ago, and you can you can find it on YouTube with a rather more musical rendering, but you'll have to make do now with with my 70-year-old, my 90-year-old, kidding myself, my 90-year-old croaky voice. The Romans were the masters when Jesus walked the land. In Judea and in Galilee they ruled with an iron hand. And the poor were sick with hunger, and the rich were clothed in splendor, and the rebels whipped and crucified hung rotting as a warning. And Jesus knew the answer, said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's," said, "Love your enemies." But Judas was a zealot and he wanted to be free. "Resist," he said, "the Romans' tyranny." So stand up for Judas. It was stand up for Judas. And the cause that Judas served, it was Jesus who betrayed the poor with his word. Jesus was a conjurer, miracles were his game, and he fed the hungry thousands, and they glorified his name. He cured the lame and the leper, he calmed the wind and the weather, and the wretched flocked to touch him, so their troubles would be taken. And Jesus knew the answer. All you who labour, all you who suffer, only believe in me. But Judas sought a world where no one starved or begged for bread. The poor are always with us, Jesus said. So stand up for Judas and the cause that Judas served. It was Jesus who betrayed the poor with his word. Jesus brought division. Jesus brought division where none had been before, not the slaves against their masters, but the poor against the poor. Said Father, Son to rise up against Father, is against me was his teaching. Said Jesus, I am the answer. You unbelievers shall burn forever, shall die in your sins. Not sheep and goats, said Judas, but together we may dare shake off the chains of misery we share. So stand up for Judas and the cause that Judas served. It was Jesus who betrayed the poor with his word. Jesus stood upon the mountain with a distance in his eyes. I am the way, the life, he said, the light that never dies. So renounce all earthly treasures and pray to your heavenly Father. And he pacified the hopeless with the hope of life eternal. Said Jesus, I am the answer. All you who hunger, only remember your rewards in heaven. So Jesus preached the other world, but Judas wanted this, and he betrayed his master with a kiss. So stand up for Judas and the cause that Judas served. It was Jesus who betrayed the poor with his word. By sword and gun and crucifix, Christ's gospel has been spread, and 2,000 cruel years have shown the way that Jesus led. The heretics burned and tortured, the butchering bloody crusaders, the bombs and rockets sanctified that rained down death from heaven. They followed Jesus. They knew the answer. You unbelievers must be believers or else be broken. So put no trust in saviours, Judas said, for every one must be to his or her own self a son.
Thank you very much, comrades. Thank you. I don't know, Jack, do you want to say something on that? No, we'll just have a discussion. Now, if you want to stay, Leon, would be great. It's obviously you're taking Jesus from the Bible rather than the one that Jack described. But as we discussed, very much a controversial, it just a contested figure, contested history. John, I'm going to bring you in now because you also want to say something around those issues.
Thanks, Tina. I would like to make a shameless plug for my book before I start. This is the book, Behind the Myths. It's about the foundations of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and religion. I'll put a link for it on the chat later. I liked a lot of what Jack said, because, but what I didn't like in what Jack said, and in what Leon said, was it was definitely a lean towards the idea that the Gospels are some kind of historical truth. The Gospels are myths written at the end of the 1st century, and I would no more take them as history than I would take the dialogue in the various episodes of Robin Hood that I used to watch when I was a little boy. It's myths. You cannot take that as history. Now, there are historical sources, and Jack mentioned them, and they are Josephus. The best one is, that's how I pronounce his name, by the way. The other books of Josephus, and Josephus did describe huge rebellious movements, and some of these leaders. And by the way, the name Jesus didn't exist in Palestine first century. It was Joshua. Many of the leaders of the rebellions were called Joshua. There was a one named by Kautsky as Joshua the Egyptian. There were itinerant preachers who were called Joshua. There were all kinds of rebels who were called Joshua. It was probably one of the most common names in the Jewish community. Lots of people were called Joshua. So when the myths were written at the end of the first century, of course, some of these real historical events were kind of woven in there, along with all of the myths. I mean, the myth of the virgin birth, that was taken directly from half a dozen other religious sects. Even the sect of Mithras had a virgin birth. There were all kinds of miracles in all other religions, and they were woven in, and we can't take any of them at all as any kind of historical evidence or any kind of historical movement. The Romans left us many, many records, many descriptions of events, and Josephus did the same. And none of them mention the biography that we read in the New Testament. Now, another reason why it's obvious that these biographies were written late is that the earliest, and I mean the very earliest, Christian writings that are attributed by scholars as to be Christian writings, do not mention the biography of Jesus. Look at the writings of Paul. I mean, his authentic writings, because only about half of the epistles of Paul in the New Testament were actually written by Paul. But if you look at the authentic epistles of Paul, there's nothing in there about the virgin birth. There's nothing in there about the Sermon on the Mount. There's nothing in there about feeding the 5,000, making the lame walk, making the blind see. None of that. And yet this guy, Paul, was supposed to have spent 2 weeks talking to the disciples of Jesus, living with them, talking with them, allegedly not long after Jesus was crucified. So why doesn't Paul mention any of the biography of Jesus, any of these miracles in his writings? It's because the stories hadn't been written then. There are other early Christian texts, like there's a book called the Shepherd of Hermas, which is an early Christian text. Again, there's nothing in that about the biography of Jesus. Even the book of Revelation, which did find its way into the New Testament, it's got nothing about the biography of Jesus or the life of Jesus. It's all a myth, and you cannot take that as any kind of basis for evidence, and that's why, you know, in that sense, I think the starting point for an analysis should be Josephus, and it should be the writings, the authentic writings of the Romans and the things that have been passed down to us. Now, Josephus described in the early part of the first century a revolutionary atmosphere, and the Jewish society was in ferment. There were all kinds of sects, there were all kinds of messianic cults. By the way, Joshua in Hebrew meant salvation. So you could see why that name was very, very prominently linked with salvation sects. There were all kinds of sects, and one of these, as Jack pointed out, were the Essenes. There were also a sect who were believed to be the same people as the Essenes, called the Ebionites. The Ebionites were the poor, and they consciously went among the people. They were poor, they lived in communities that were communist and so on. And they were the kind of organizations that were the real starting point of what became the Joshua sect, the most important Joshua sect, which Paul attached himself to. But when he spread and the biographies hadn't been written then, so we had no Gospels, we had no New Testament. when Paul began to establish communities, these were communities that were revolutionary communities within the Jewish society. Jewish societies were established all over the Roman Empire. And Paul was writing to the Jewish sect supporters within the Jewish communities in Corinth and other places around the Eastern Mediterranean. And that was the origin, I think, of the Christian religion. It changed a lot, of course, after that. Very, very quickly, as soon as the Joshua sect developed, it developed leaders, local bishops, and so on. And that, again, that led to the corruption of the church. I think one thing that Kautsky got wrong, or at least he didn't deal with it, he didn't explain, was how the Christian church developed, why it developed in the way it did. It wasn't because of theological discussions and revelations that people had. It was because the community was a mutual support community. The Jewish communities were as well, by the way. But to enter the Jewish community, you had to be circumcised. You had to follow very strict dietary laws. Whereas Paul's community, the Joshua sect within the Jewish community, was like Judaism light. You didn't have to be circumcised. You didn't have to follow the same strict dietary laws, and that's why it grew at the expense of the Jewish community. A lot of this is in my book. I'll put a link in the chat in a moment. But that's I think is the only way from a Marxist point of view, from the point of view of historical materialism, that you can actually look at the foundations of Christianity.
Thank you, John. Jack, do you want to reply to some of this now or later? Okay. Mark.
Can I just say,
go on, Leon.
One thing. You say, talk about the Gospels being myths. They're not really. They are deliberate pro-Roman anti-Jewish propaganda. And this isn't surprising because they were written at a time when the Jews were particularly unpopular, having risen in revolt against their oppressors. This has resonances today, I think, in Palestine. And they had actually defeated the Romans in battle and slaughtered many of them. In the end, the Jewish revolt was put down in 70 and Jerusalem was taken again. But it's after that that the Gospels were written, and it is clear they let the Romans off the hook. Judas is the villain because that's his name means Jew, and it's led to the subsequent persecution for hundreds of years of the Jewish people. So that's my case against it.
Thanks, Leon. Marcus.
Hello, good morning from Sydney in Australia. Thanks both to Jack and Leon and also to John, actually. I mean, John in the chat earlier said, why do we spend time analysing bits of a completely made up story? I think I can kind of go along with all three of you in many ways, because we don't have Jesus as a historical fact. We know that the Gospels were made up either as propaganda or as pieces of ideology for an emergent oppressor regime in the Roman Empire. So we know that. So why do we study it? And first of all, I'd say, I mean, more than 2 billion people believe some version of this story in one form or another, maybe not very strongly or passionately or as truth, but at least as some sort of parable. So I think as Marxists, as people who want to storm the heavens and overthrow existing society, we need to have our own myths and our own understandings and our own explanation, not just made up, but based in a historical understanding of the emergence of Christianity, where it came from as materially, why it transformed from ideas of rebellion into ideas of oppression and became the gospel of the Roman Empire. And I think that's why we study it. And I think the stories of Jesus, I mean, I grew up in an atheist, communistic, Jewish family, and my mother used to read Bible stories, Old Testament, New Testament, Aesop's fables, Grimm's fables, as all different made up stories. But she always said, you know, we believe in what the Christians believe in, we just don't have the religious bit connected to it. And I think there is something passionate and humanistic even in the Jesus story as it's filtered through its oppressive intent. So I think understanding it as materially is very important, because we need to have a strong humanistic story about the past, the present, and the future if we want 2 billion plus people to go along with our ideas. So I think it's a very important way to understand it, and to grapple with the story. I spent a little bit of time in the Philippines with comrades from the Communist Party of the Philippines, which was an underground organization, and I saw basic Christian communities in mountains where you had a priest with a gun on his shoulder, liberation theologist. They'd sing the Internationale, and then he would give Jesus's body to people. So still very strange ideas mixed up with this. Anyway, Merry Christmas and Happy Hanukkah to everybody, and hope you all have a wonderful 2025. Hopefully it's better for all of us. And I just wanted to thank Leon. I've loved that song for many years, obviously made famous by Dick Gaughan, but it's wonderful that you could have joined us today and shared your communistic Christian spirit with us all. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. Anne, please.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the talk, Jack, and for your song, Leon. I very much enjoyed it.
Can I just add one last quote, because it seems very apropos. Paul Harrison wrote this. He's an environmental writer. He says, Christ can be used and has been used as a motivation for total self-sacrifice to bring about justice on earth, or for giving 0.01% of one's annual income to Oxfam or the NSPCC, as an inspiration to die resisting tyranny, or to turn the other cheek to oppression, to take up arms for socialism or against it. The truth is that humans have to decide for themselves what kind of society is best and how to achieve it. The Gospels, unfortunately, or fortunately, don't provide a lot of help. We're on our own.
Okay. Okay. So I just want to take this from the perspective of religion as an expression of society. And I think that when you consider the Bible, although yes, it is mythical, but mythical doesn't mean that it's just developed out of somebody's head. It relates to society either in a normative way. I mean, the virgin birth, that's something about the place of women. You know, the women are to be virgins before marriage. I think that must be the very kind of core of that, or the shame of, there's something about like shame about women and sex there. Obviously Adam and Eve and shame, you know, the fact that the women destroyed the paradise that society had been living in before then. So I mean, we've had people from radical anthropology previously speak about that and those myths, and they're so interesting and do really mean something. And like, for instance, in Ireland, there are lots of myths about, you know, Cuchulainn and different like characters in history, but they do, when you consider them, they do actually mean something in history. At the time, they were saying something about society, the struggles going on in society. And I think that for those societies back then religion was how you express struggles. So God was, or the demons or the spirit world were very much part of your world. So that's how I see it. And so, but what I wanted to ask Jack about is the fact that this is one piece of, the world, the Levant, where these three world religions have come from, seems to me to be extremely interesting. And I know that Islam didn't develop until maybe something like 6 centuries after Christianity, but it came out of Christianity and Judaism, as far as I know. And like, it's interesting when you think about, let's say, like Bethlehem. So Bethlehem is in the West Bank, that's still part of, just about under it's just still part of Palestine. And I think it's called Bethlehem, and it's means something like the house of meat. And then there are words for it in Hebrew. So it suggests that it was a place that Jewish people and Muslims lived. But I mean, obviously, I don't know what the history is of how they came about. But I just wondered whether you could say anything about that. And then just finally, in terms of today, you've seen the Pope attend, I think, a ceremony where the baby Jesus was wrapped in a keffiyeh, and apparently afterwards it was taken away. There was some controversy about it. There's been a few here in Ireland. There's been a few occasions on which, when it's been made an issue for churches that they've been asked to wrap the baby Jesus in the keffiyeh. And they've said, oh, yes, that's interesting, but we're not sure that we could do this. Obviously, it's symbolic of the fact that this is where that baby Jesus came from, is now at the center of maybe not a genocide when it comes to the West Bank, but immense suffering and apartheid. And I think that Christianity has generally got a very hostile attitude towards Islam, which I'm not sure exactly how that came about historically. But anyway, in today's world, they don't want to do that. They don't want to accept that is any real part of them. They don't want, I suppose, for Jesus to be seen as a Palestinian, but he actually was. If he was born today, he would be Palestinian. Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Anne. Jack, you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Tina. I mean, I thought I'd come in simply on the basis if I don't come in now, I'll forget or just become too much. Yeah, thanks for all the contributions. Of course, the four Gospels are myth, but the idea that myth is worthless or we can't learn anything about history, I think that's false. What we actually learn, first of all, is the thought world of those we think who wrote it. And I agree with what John said. I mean, I'm well aware of the history of the writing of the Gospels, but also what I would argue is you couldn't just write anything. Right. So what is interesting to me about the New Testament, but also the Old Testament, is that you get contradictory stories. And it's not that one is true and the other one's a lie, but you've actually got both contained in it. So, of course, I accept that if you take the earlier stuff that we have in terms of the New Testament, it's got nothing to do with Jesus's family tree. But what I would ask is, if you take current Christian theology of where Jesus is born of a virgin, where Jesus is conceived of by the Holy Spirit, why on earth would you have in two Gospels a family tree tracing Jesus back to King David? Like, well, it must have some significance. That's all I'm arguing. and it must say something about this particular tradition, because it's clearly in contradiction with what I was taught when I went to my church when I was a little kid. I was brought up in the Church of England tradition. And I would also argue that as well as the Bible being a myth, I mean, we've got plenty of other myths that tell us a great deal about the thought world of people. So Beowulf, or the Iliad, or the Odyssey. To me, these books are, worth their weight in gold, not because they are true historically, but they can be investigated using Marxism. You can investigate them using the techniques that people have applied to Shakespeare. Did Shakespeare really write Shakespeare? It's certainly true that, there was no such person as Luke, Mark, or John. We know for fact that these were collective works of all sorts of authors coming in before they were finalized. But for me as a Marxist, what I'm out to do isn't to claim that Jesus is an equivalent of me or us. What I am saying, though, is that if we can discover something that, how should I put it, that approximates to the truth, it is useful for us to understand how we got to where we've got today. That's what I would argue. And I'd also argue in that sense that we shouldn't be too cocky. For example, in terms of myself, I've had arguments over the years with Trotskyist comrades who treat the Lessons of October by one Leon Trotsky as the equivalent, not of the gospel as myth, but the gospel as the word of truth. No, in my view, it's a myth. Doesn't mean that it should be dismissed, doesn't mean that it's untrue, but it needs to be investigated with a critical mind. And so when Leon talks about, well, we basically need to decide ourselves, that's absolutely right. We need to think, but we need to think on the basis of informed thinking. I'm not necessarily convinced by Marcus that we need our own myth or we need some sort of humanism. To me, Paul, I don't know how I would equate him, but I would call him the Pauline school of falsification. Does that make him good? Does that make him bad? I don't know. I'm skeptical about that. And I liked what you said. I think that was very, very good. I was going to add again on the question of myths, precisely on the basis of RAG, the Radical Anthropology group. I'm told, for example, that when you had British colonial authorities go and talk, through translators to the Aborigines, the original inhabitants of Australia, and the Aborigines would tell them their stories, the colonial authorities just went, what a load of rubbish. The universe wasn't born out of some snake goddess, it's obvious. So they just dismissed these stories as worthless. But actually, if we take these so-called myths, actually what we've got here is science. What we've got is medicine. What we've actually got is origin story. It doesn't make it true in the literal sense, in our Western sense, but precisely there are profound truths in the religion, in the myths of so-called primitive peoples. So I myself would, I definitely wouldn't take a dismissive attitude to the Bible, and nor would I claim that Josephus in the Jewish War or the Antiquities isn't myth on the equivalent of Trotsky's, let alone Stalin's History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union (B). He's making things up to justify himself. He's entertaining his audience. Josephus didn't have a modern idea of what history is. So yeah, he's putting words into people's mouths, but that doesn't mean that these books are worthless. They are worth a great deal if we investigate them, using our brain and using the theories that we have, from science and from Marxism. And just finally, in terms of what Anne, you were asking, I don't know. Yes, you're right obviously about Islam, and certainly Christianity is an incredibly intolerant religion. But all I can tell you, and this is sort of my take on things, is that for my purposes, what is significant about the Bible is that the Bible has Jesus being born in Bethlehem. And that to me is significant, not because he was born in Bethlehem, but because the writers thought it was a good idea for him to be born in Bethlehem. Why? Because this was the royal seat before David. If you read your Old Testament, before David went to Jerusalem and became king, his hometown was Bethlehem. And therefore, it's a bit like, I'm not saying that the Windsors, Liz and Chaz and all these people were born in Windsor. But imagine if they claimed to come from Windsor as opposed to Saxe-Coburg in Germany. And I went along to Windsor so that my child could be born here. And I put him up and say, here's the king. It's that sort of thing. That's my understanding. I think it's not because it's true, but this tells you something about Jesus. This tells you something also about James, who's a lot more evidence of. And it tells you something not about Jesus founding a separate religion to Judaism, but precisely in terms of his understanding and Joseph's and James and Simeon. These people thought of themselves as true to Judaism. They were not founding a separate religion. They were loyal to their religion. That's my understanding.
Thank you. Fascinating discussion. I'm really glad that, as Marxists, we can have this discussion rather than just say, a la Richard Dawkins, religion is clearly rubbish and it's all a lie. And to investigate what's true about it is, I think, hugely important for us. Ian.
Thank you, Jack. It's a really good presentation. You'll be delighted to know my Christmas reading is going to be fantastic reality, and I'm in there, so I made a start. I just want to ask a couple of questions and then make a little point. Firstly, St. John's Gospel is very different from the other synoptic Gospels. Is this the beginnings of an attempt to differentiate writers from those who would otherwise have supported Jewish uprisings and therefore trying to make it more acceptable to the Roman oppressor? That's one question. The other question is, how do we account for the rise of monotheism? Is this the growth of the market, given Abraham Leon's analysis of the rise of the Jewish people as a nation class in the context of a trading nation, as it were, the monotheism being, the idea of a universality of an equivalence through the marketplace. So those are the questions. I agree with the points you've made about mythology. Mythology isn't just stuff made up. It expresses something very profound, and that's why, of course, myths continue to grow. Myths have thrown light upon things which are not necessarily accessible to mere empirical data, as it were, but there is a relationship, of course. And of course, then I wanted to come on to my thrill at hearing that Leon was going to be speaking tonight because of my admiration for your work. And of course, in The World Turned Upside Down, you sing of Gerard Winstanley and the sin of private property. Whilst we may not think of our own myths, as it were. It just throws up the interrelationship between art and myth, where, for example, something can be expressed in an artistic form or even a religious form, but expressing a reality, expressing a desire. So to speak of the sin of private property, it is an interesting case in point. And you know, I think it would be unreasonable not to expect that to arise in the future. And how should we respond to it, given that, for example, Lenin wrote a pamphlet about God building, which was bogostроительство, which was a kind of a notion that somehow we should kind of invent our own religion, and that's kind of approach to it. But thank you for a very good talk, and I will continue to read. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. I should have mentioned that. Thanks, Ian, for reminding me. I've actually not mentioned it. Jack Conrad has written a book, Fantastic Reality, which I just put the link in the chat, and I also send it out via email. Agnes, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep. Hi.
Okay, so I've got one question and one comment, if I may. My question is that to all these distinguished people on the panel and contributors and so on, am I wrong in thinking that basic genuine Christianity and basic genuine communism are kind of one and the same, which would make Jesus, whether it's legendary or real, the first communist? So that's my question. And my comment is that this Jesus story, unfortunately, did create an awful lot of anti-Semitism for the centuries, but it also created some utterly wonderful masterpieces, and Ian referred to art. And I just want to mention that when you listen to Bach's St. Matthew Passion or Bach's St. John Passion, never mind whether it's imaginary, real, historically evident, it just tells you everything you need to know about human nature, and I very highly recommend the St. Matthew Passion by Bach. Sorry about this comment.
Absolutely. No, really good comment. Thank you, comrade. Absolutely. Rob.
Hello. I did miss a part of your talk, Jack. I'm sorry, I had some internet trouble. But I was really listening to what everybody's kind of talking about, and the kind of understanding the origins of Christianity, and is it a revolutionary movement that's spread? I mean, there's a long gestation period before it's adopted by the Roman Empire. I think that needs to be acknowledged. There's a long time where you have increasingly Christian resistances to Roman religions. It was in Roman law that you had to pay tribute to the gods, you had to sacrifice to the gods, and of course Christians were completely against that. So there's this kind of fundamental ideological difference between Roman religion and Christianity that was completely unresolvable from a Christian perspective. The Romans, and with other religions, had always been tolerant. They had always kind of taken in aspects of the religions of the places that they went to as part of their kind of assimilation into the communities that they went into. They say, oh, you've got this God, that's kind of like our God. So you've got monotheism and the absence of sacrifice in a literal sense. Obviously, you've got the kind of metaphysical sacrifice of Jesus for all people, but the absence of the tribute to the gods being a kind of fundamental contradiction to the Roman theology. So before the Council of Nicaea and before the adoption of Christianity wholesale by the Roman Empire, you've got this gestation period where you've got all these Christian sects all over the Roman world, with views that we can only guess at in a lot of senses. We don't have a lot of written records. And, again, I think this comes back to the kind of idea of the myth elements of Christianity, that you've got again, we're completely dismissing the validity of oral history and oral transmission of myth, right? That many societies pre-literacy were had oral traditions for their myths and stories, and there's no surprise that even within a couple of generations, some of the stories become exaggerated, become different from what they were originally said before they were recorded. So you've got that aspect, again, where you can learn from myth, and I agree with that. What I would say is that I think as Marxists we have to tread carefully here. I think Marx does describe religion as the opiate of the peoples, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's an amelioration to the conditions of the working class. It's helps keep the working class in position, because they are sedated by the opiate. It's not necessarily. I mean, Marx isn't thinking of it as the kind of addictive, harmful drug that we think of it now. It was much more common in his day for people to be down at the opium den. It didn't have the same connotations that we associate with opiates today. So, with that in mind, I think there's lots of. You can take. I don't think he's necessarily absolutely against a lot of the teachings, and he does often reference the kind of Christian socialists as, although flawed, representing a step forward in progression. So there's that aspect of it. I don't think it's necessarily a contradiction. I mean, we could get onto a theological discussion about the validity of Christianity. I think. There's lots of older traditions of Christianity that still exist: Ethiopian Christianity, Coptic Christianity. These Christianities that weren't influenced as much by Paul and the Greeks as others, and their teachings are different. They've got slightly different gospels, slightly different interpretation of Jesus' message. I think the bottom line is you can take what you want from Christianity, and that's where its problem lies. There is no concrete description of Jesus, but with that in mind, I would like to look into that a little bit further. I know I'm going on, Tina. I'll try and keep this quite brief. So we've got Jesus, who we've shown is from Nazareth. We know he's a carpenter, or from a carpenting family, right? Now, again, put yourself in the historical context of first century Judea, and being a carpenter. It's a skilled profession. He has access to Greek. We know that he probably speaks Greek. You got Simon Peter, Simon the Rock, right? Petra from the Greek. What are the cultural influences that are going on in Judea at that time? Where are they coming from? They're on the coast. They've got access to trade routes from Greece. They've got the library at Alexandria, not far away, right? All the kind of nexus of ancient learning could potentially be meeting in Judea at this time. So you can see a lot of Plato in the New Testament. You can see a lot, there's elements of Buddhism within the teachings of Christianity, the death of the self, the self-sacrifice that you don't, you get this amalgamation of ideas. So whether Jesus is real or not, I think what we can say is that Christianity represents a kind of pinnacle of philosophical learning from Judea at that time, and it spreads in its own way and transforms and morphs to the societies that it ends up in. And obviously we've got the Greek model that kind of persisted with Paul and that, which is, I think, coming back to kind of what Anne was saying about the kind of the anti-feminist kind of streaks in Paul, because that's where a lot of it comes from. That's very Greek. If you look at the Greek sources, they denigrate women a lot. They're not pro women at all. So you've got all these kind of influences that patch onto it. So I think it's a complex diffusion of lots of different ideas, and I do think we can learn a lot from it. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Anne and Marcus want to come back in, but I thought I'd just quickly read the whole quote from Marx, because that is a very interesting one. People know always the last bit, but the first bit is much more interesting. It's: religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. So I think that puts it in a slightly different way of what you just read out, but it is the famous part. And quickly then, Marcus.
Yeah, okay. So I just wanted to come back to clarify something that I said about the Levant, because I've just had a bit of an exchange with Marcus, and I think that maybe I wasn't clear. So what I'm saying is that these religions, the three main world religions, originate, it appears, from this part of the world. And at the time of the Ottoman Empire, the peoples of that area were interpenetrated. So there were Muslims, Christians, Jewish people living in that area, sharing those cities and towns. I can't say exactly where or how exactly where people lived, but that certainly was the case. Now, today, Bethlehem is somewhere which is very important for Christianity at this time of the year as the birthplace of Jesus. And so, as well as being biblical, Christianity also tries to present itself as, an expression of our humanity at its highest, which I'm sure all religions do. But for that reason, I think it's arguable that Catholic churches and Christian churches should express their opposition to the genocide now happening and the apartheid system in Palestine by putting a keffiyeh on the baby Jesus. The Pope did it, and I think it is a good, in a way, it's religion becoming political, but expressing politics from a good perspective rather than the conservative manner in which they generally do. And then I just want to say that I think that religion is still very much alive. Of course, it's alive in all sorts of ways, but the a la carte religion, which is what we generally have now in Ireland, which I'm sure is very hard for lots of people that don't live here to understand, means that people will still go to mass at Christmas, will still have their children christened, will still maybe have a church funeral or whatever, or a church wedding, depends on how big they want their wedding. But like they are not how can I say, it's not the heart of a heartless world in that sense that it was before. So that quote of Marx is good, but I think to me it seems to me to sort of like religion is on the people. I think that people can put their own mark on religion by pushing back against it, by saying, I'll have this but not this. And I think that is that's an expression of society becoming more secular, but it's certainly something, and that's not just Ireland today. There are many parts of the world, there are many different forms of Islam, different practices, and for some people, it's like, I can't remember what exactly the name of the sect is, but there would be some, I know I'm finishing, it would be just in nature, God is in nature. It wouldn't be in any way associated with prayer and those other strictures that are imposed on more other animism. Thank you, Ian. I'll finish there, Tina. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, we just want to finish by 9, really, and we've got a couple more people with their hand up. John wants to come back in as well, but first, Marcus.
Thanks. I'll be quick. And no, I think we're speaking at cross purposes in the chat there. I agree with what you're saying there, and it's great to see people putting their political stamp from below on elements of religion, particularly around the struggle against the genocide. What I was pointing to there is that there was a lot of throwing back in history. I mean, the Zionists are doing it by claiming that they've always been in this land, but I think Palestinians as a modern emerging nation also do similar things like all nations, creating their myth, pretending that they've always been there as a people in a non-materialistic way. Jack, by saying creating our own myths, I just meant that we have a compelling narrative is really all I mean. I don't think we should be making things up, but I think that the left has lost that sort of hegemonic narrative of what it is to be human and what we could be in a future society. And I think by grappling with and trying to have a materialist understanding of the emergence of religion in a sympathetic way, not in a Richard Dawkins way, I think is the way forward. I still always remember Terry Eagleton's review of The God Delusion in the London Review of Books. It's one of the first. It says, reading Richard Dawkins on religion is like reading someone on ornithology who's only ever read the Standard Book of British Birds. I think was the opening line of that. So I think that's what I mean by a kind of a humanist understanding of religion in its totality, not a sort of a very dry, materialistic rejection of religion that Dawkins does.
Thanks, Marcus. John, before I bring back Leon and Jack.
Thanks, Gina. I just wanted to say something about this, about myths. Of course, myths are written in a particular social context, and those who write the myths and write the stories are trying to deliver a message that has a particular social and political context for their time. And it often reflects, in a distorted way, real history. And of course, from that point of view, we do look at myths from a Marxist point of view and from a scientific point of view. However, that doesn't mean to say that the content of those myths is history. And for instance, in the people who wrote the Gospels at the end of the first century, why did they include all the miracles? Why was this Son of God, this great supernatural central character? It's because it fitted in with the kind of standard Greek and Roman mythology and religious stories at the time. Now, Jack mentioned the family trees going back to David. Of course, that has a significance. The significance lies in the fact that the writers of the gospel were trying to justify their sect in the eyes of Jewish people. Jews were 10% of the Roman Empire, 10% of the population, in large communities all over the Mediterranean particularly. And they were the main converts in the early decades, in the first century. They were the main converts to Christianity, because Christianity was just Judaism light, without the circumcision, without the but they had attached to this idea of a particular Messiah, or it became attached to the idea. So that's why the writer of these myths introduced little bits and pieces from, if you like, Jewish history. Introduced things like quotations from the Old Testament, from Jewish scripture. Introduced this idea of Jesus coming from the city of David. These were all there to convince the Jewish part of their contacts, if you like, to come into the community, to justify the sect in the eyes of Jewish converts. So yes, I'm in favour of looking at these myths and examining what were the motivations of the author in writing this and saying that and describing this. I'm all in favour of that. But what you cannot do is take the content of the myths as history, which unfortunately too many people do. They take specific episodes, specific instances of miracles or events and things like this, which we haven't got the slightest proof that they ever existed. And then they use this as a starting point for writing or describing or interpreting history. And that is a misuse of history. That's not history. That's not science. That's using the myths in the wrong way.
Thank you, John. Leon, do you want to come back before I bring in Jack? Do you want to say anything about the discussion?
No, not really, no.
No, okay. Over to you then, Jack.
Yeah, thanks, comrades. Just once again, very stimulating contributions. Yeah, just on Ian to begin with. The Gospels, in terms of history, as they get more modern, they become more anti-Semitic. And precisely what you get in John is, the blaming of the Jewish people. You get Jesus denouncing the Jewish people, which is hard to imagine. But that says something. And I do think that the argument that the Jewish Revolution of 66 to 70 clearly marked a turning point in terms of the Pauline wing of that party denouncing its past, reinventing itself. In that sense, to be Jewish after or during the Jewish Revolution in Palestine was quite a risky thing. You wouldn't have been trusted by the Roman authorities. So yeah, they were numerous, but hey, these guys that have just risen up and taken on Roman legions and have withstood a siege for 4 years, and they keep doing it. They did it in 6. They did it in 66. They did it in the next century. Either way, we get a reinvention of the religion. I think that's clear. In terms of monotheism, I myself, I mean, I don't know. I mean, all I can do is say that to me, I wouldn't necessarily link it with the market, and I wouldn't link it with, oh, the Jews became monotheistic and therefore mercantile people. Because we're dealing with people then, peasants. So we're not just dealing with merchants. We're dealing with all classes in Palestine. And what we've got is evidence, at least, when it comes to where the elite were sent in exile, for example, to Babylon, that they are almost reaching the point of where you might have 100 names for different gods, but the more sophisticated people are saying there's only really one God. You get in Egypt, the emergence of a supreme God. You got Aten and Akhenaten. Okay, that's cut short, but nonetheless, I mean, I would argue, again, this is pretty thin ice, but I would argue that this is much more to do with state power than it is mercantilism. In other words, what we've got with Constantine is the downgrading of the Senate, the downgrading of the ruling class in favor of an individual and the state promoted by the army. And, what you have is the church playing a junior role. So I personally, as I say, pretty thin ice, would look at state power as opposed to market relations. After all, if we look just north of Palestine, you've got Phoenicia, where the Jewish religion comes from. El, Yahweh, their Phoenician gods, they were merchants, there's no doubt about that. So anyway, I think this is something to be investigated. In terms of God building, I think I got to it, unless I got you wrong, Ian, I'm going to excuse Lenin here. No, Lenin was attacking the God builders, i.e. Bogdanov and Lunacharsky, who advocated God building on the basis that the proletariat and the peasantry, but the proletariat needs something simple. And therefore what we'll do is we'll invent myths, and we'll invent myths for them. Lenin was attacking that. So as far as I know. Agnes, a really interesting question. Yeah, I think that what you have here in Palestine in the 1st century BC and in the 1st century AD, to use the old terminology, is loads of communists, not just Jesus. The rich should give away all their money, sell everything you have. You've got the Essenes. You've got the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. Communism was pretty widespread. So I wouldn't say myself that Jesus was the first. He was one of many, right? And in that sense, Jesus was one of us. That doesn't mean that he was a Marxist or would, accept our draft program, but he was a communist. And there've been many communists throughout history. After all, at once, we were all communists. That's where we come from as a human species. So, you know, as our, how should I put it, Marx used the word species being. Our species being is cooperative, it's communistic. That's what enables us to have language. That's what enables us to have culture. It's communism, not competition, not capitalism, not feudalism, not oppression. It's communism. So communism is what we began with as a human species. You've got all the myths in religion about the fall, Eden, and all the rest of it. There's a truth there. Doesn't mean it's true, but there's a truth there. Okay. I'm glad that Tina came in with the opium of the people. Too many people know only the word opium, and as Rob himself pointed out, its negative side, i.e. people just downing some drug and blowing their minds. But also religion is the encyclopedia of the world, and that's how I've been trying to treat it. And again, just to add to what Rob was saying, we today have four main gospels, don't we? You know, the four books of the New Testament. You know, you can pick it up, the apocryphal books that didn't make it into the Bible, that apparently, according to at least the volume I've got, were excluded because they didn't have the same merit. Well, I've read them, and they tell different stories. They got different myths, but as literary works, they're equal to the four. And just, was Jesus a carpenter? I shrug my shoulders. I don't know. That's what we're told. I don't know why we're told that. I just don't know. It might be true. It might not be true. But Jesus, I think you can make the argument, and I think it's correct, was well educated. I don't think that we should have the view that he could have taken a trip to Alexandria and popped into the library and read up on the Greek. And we're talking about the ancient world, and very few ordinary people would have traveled, distances. Either way, what you've got is part of the world that might have a load of Hebrew speakers in terms of their religion, Aramaic. What you've got is Greek. You'll have some Latin. You'd have had a multi, cultured, to use a phrase, Palestine. You had Jews versus Greek. So all sorts of different religions, all sorts of different cultures, all sorts of different levels of learning, which can both be rejected, but also incorporated. And clearly, if we take Paul, our understanding of Paul, he was thoroughly imbued with Greek ideas. He was Jewish. These ideas spread, ideas move. They're not fixed to one particular people. Just finally, just a couple of points. The Pope, Palestine, okay, great. But we shouldn't be soft on the Pope. I've got a book behind me by a guy called G.E.M. St. de Croix, great historian of the Roman and Greek world, Marxist. And he says that I would never step inside a church given the crimes of the church. And he's talking about the Catholic Church and the Church of England. And sort of, I've got a similar emotional, not rational, emotional reaction to it. 2,000 years of oppression, 2,000 years of excusing oppression, 2,000 years, I'm being a bit artistic here, but 2,000 years of collaborating with those in power. The Pope is a prince. Look at how he dresses in finery and jewelry. This isn't to do with the poor. They talk about the poor, but actually the church is an instrument of the rich, and it consoles the poor. It befuddles the poor. So the Catholic religion, the Church of England, they're not the same as, the Winstanley and the Diggers and all the rest of it. So I'm not saying all religion is the same, by the way, but I do have a strong reaction, emotional reaction, a gut reaction against the religion of the ruling class. I've consumed it, shoving it down my throat. Okay, I've learned, but I don't want to express my sympathy with the Pope personally. And just lastly, in terms of what John was saying, in terms of at least my understanding, John, of the first converts to Paul, we're talking about Gentiles. Reread your Acts of the Apostles. That's what he reports to Jesus's brothers. They don't mind that, but precisely he's softening the religion. And note that Paul has to flee from the mob. They are so enraged with him watering down the religion. And the Jesus party want to disassociate themselves from the Pauline party. So Paul converting Orthodox Jews, they would be circumcised. It's Gentiles that need circumcising. It's Gentiles that he's relaxing the dietary codes. And maybe just one final point for Anne. I don't think if you take Orthodox Jewry or Orthodox Judaism of the 1st century BC or the 1st century AD, they would be hot on the liberation of women. I think they were all down on women. All these sort of religions are against women. It's primitive communism. It's the earlier polytheistic religions that tend to be much more women's liberation, women's freedom, women's expression, women gods, women priests. It's the monotheistic, intolerant religions that clamp down on women's rights in a disgusting way. Again, sorry for the emotion.
Can I just
go on, Leon? Yeah, go on.
Can I just add one small anecdote may amuse you? I sang Stand Up for Judas in Belfast some years ago. I didn't intend to, but I was asked to because apparently it is a favourite song of the IRA. I don't know what you make of that.
Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Thank you very much, both of you. I think Jesus as a sort of communist or a group of communists at that time, I think is a good way to look at it. And of course, as Jack said, once we're all communists, and hopefully that should give us inspiration to a future where we can all be communists again and be truly free. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Leon. We're having a Christmas break if you're into that sort of thing. Otherwise, we're just having a break. And we're back on January the 9th. See you then, comrades. Great session today. Thank you both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.